There comes a point in someone's life where they're constantly trying to chase that same high, the rush of dopamine and the serotonin that a once beloved hobby gave them. Perhaps it isn't Yu-Gi-Oh that you fell out of love with. Maybe it's the slow, subconscious realization that playing Yu-Gi-Oh will never take you back to that period in life where all you had to worry about was double XP weekend in Modern Warfare 2, or your Mountain Dew coupons being valid and the pizza toppings you're gonna order. No! The problem is Fuelos. Just one more ban list and the game is fixed.
I've been saying this exact phrase since 2011.
My name is Farfa and today I'll be your guide through the polemics of quitting Yu-Gi-Oh! Why did you quit? Why did you stop playing? And what was the last straw that made that love for the game fade away? There's been somewhat of a ruckus over the last couple of months with people quitting for various reasons within Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm gonna dissect each one in complete depth, highlighting the negatives while also trying to tie in some positives, debunking some of the myths as well. I've just opened up channel memberships, so if you guys are interested, you can check out my videos a day early from now on by subscribing on the YouTube, and you get the customized emotes, your name plastered in the comment section, and little badges and stuff next to your name. It's just a nice way to support the channel. I've been really enjoying the content. Thanks so much for the support. Enjoy the rest of the video. For something involving putting pictures and text on cardboard, you would think that surely my singular Chase Extra deck secret rare isn't going to require in-depth knowledge of circumventing the organ donation black market. But for as long as ever really, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has had some really egregious expensive cards. From Blackluster Soldier to Dark Arm Dragon to Destroy Phoenix Enforcer, you can find something from every era of the game that, adjusted for inflation, could buy you enough shares in Tesla for those Cybertrucks to still be pieces of shit. Summary! Yu-Gi-Oh! Is an extremely expensive game that will cost a significant amount of money to be on the cutting edge of. However, with such an expansive card pool and a wide array of reprint options, there are alternatives that allow you to play the game at a somewhat competitive level for significantly less. Now let's dive into the details here and talk about each point, positive and negative. Now without a doubt, this was the biggest, greatest point of feedback I received as the criticisms for quitting the game. Now breaking this down, it's pretty easy to see why this is such a big problem. When just glancing over some of the tournament results featuring top cut deck lists of even something a little more on the casual side like regionals, you will easily find upwards of over 4 digits in cost for winning deck lists. Over $1,000 for a deck, main side and extra. These are just simple game pieces. To even enter and play to stand a chance at the competitive level for many players is just simply asking too much. Especially when those pieces are very likely to expire or become nowhere near as playable within a year because of the metagame shift or reprints. And comparatively, there are a lot of other card games popping up finding success and completely yoinking swaths of ex-Yu-Gi-Oh! Players into their fold. Star Wars decks can cost maybe 200 max, One Piece decks are around about that same price range, and Pokemon potentially even cheaper. For the price of the best Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck list, it is not uncommon to be able to afford multiple decks of other card games. If I enjoy Yu-Gi-Oh! But I also enjoy Pokemon, around about the same amount, let's say I have a 70% interest in Pokemon and a 75% interest in Yu-Gi-Oh! A deciding factor for me here might potentially just be to play the cheaper game, even though I actually like Yu-Gi-Oh! For a lot of players, this is a logical conclusion. Why would I play Yu-Gi-Oh! When I can play other games for a fraction of the cost, and even if I was to spend the same amount of money in those card games as I would in Yu-Gi-Oh!, I'd be able to buy like 5 different decks, switching up my playstyle and enjoying different styles of the game and from different angles whenever I want and whenever I go to locals, or compete at higher events. Now that sounds pretty bad, but conversely, let's take a look at the flip side and some of the other points here. Now Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game with plenty of viable budget options. For as long as the game has been around, format to format, there have been pretty cheap alternatives to the best deck lists. Here's a regional where the top 2 decks were Ritual Beast and Sky Striker, getting 1st and 2nd respectively, while both remaining under a cost of $150 for complete lists. And at the most recent YCS at Bologna, there were 6 Ritual Beasts in top cut as an example of a budget alternative to the top tier meta decks playing Fiendsmith. And we also saw a bunch of other decks at Bologna making top cut. We saw Labyrinth, Centurion, Rescue Ace, a lot of decks not running Fiendsmith as an engine, and even in top 8, there were 8 unique archetypes in the cut. So we do know, especially currently where we are today, that there are alternatives to the best decks and to the most expensive decks. Hurley is a very strong rogue deck. That thing costs literal dirt other than the staples, unless you want to play Fuelos. Melodious is a pretty cheap deck, and historically there are plenty of examples. Now, sadly, it doesn't happen as often anymore, but previously you used to be able to put 3 structure decks per year of certain archetypes and just essentially go from there. 3 Salad structure decks with some rares, 3 Monarch structure decks, Trap Tricks, certain iterations of Branded. There have been plenty of just structure deck archetypes and themes with a couple of extras from outside the structure that could basically be pretty much competitive decks. But if you do want to spend a little bit extra and juice up your budget deck with a couple of those extra deck spaces and some of those main deck pieces, then that is also an alternative for a sort of mid-range kind of cost deck. There are a lot of decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like, a lot of archetypes that even today can see some strengths at the local or regional level. And again, I can't emphasize enough just the most recent YCS at Bologna, how there was something of upwards of 10 different archetypes in Top Cut. And what I will mention as well is that the prices of a lot of these decks that you'll see on the TCG Player Card Market summaries are somewhat inflated, because the numbers on your screen right now assume that you have absolutely none of the cards and are buying these deck lists card for card, main side and extra, from scratch. Maybe you already picked up Fiendsmith. Well, that in itself just opens up 4 other potential decks that you can play, since those cores are not as expensive. And it's very likely you already have a lot of staples like hand traps and some link monsters left over, so that doesn't really factor into the cost either if you've had them for years at this point. Now look, that's not to say of course there is a very serious cost problem with Yu-Gi-Oh! When you start fully optimizing your deck lists, even things like Pearly, you will start to ramp up in that price when you get into those staples like Perulia and Flualos, etc, etc. Historically, there's been plenty examples of this. In 2016, many people missed out on simply being able to basically draw 2 cards for free at the height of Pot of Desires. There just wasn't a card that could replace this. Access Code is a game-winning extra deck piece which peaked at well over $100 for a single copy. SP Little Knight likewise, Forbidden Droplet, so many cards that are essentially staple for their respective time periods foregone completely because they themselves are the full budget that people would spend. Every single problem I just mentioned is a symptom of the current format constructive, competitive, ranked format. Konami unfortunately does a pretty bad job of promoting alternative ways to play the game outside of a couple of Time Wizard formats. Basically playing Yu-Gi-Oh! With how it used to be back in the good old days, and we've also had dual trials on Master Duel mixing things up, utilizing different archetypes you would never really think to play, and incorporating ban lists that actually hit annoying problematic cards that can make Yu-Gi-Oh! Oh so unfun. Play Time Wizard. Pick up an Edison deck for like $30. Try Go format. Build 2014 format. Draft a single booster box between yourself and 2 or 3 other friends. You can build a cube by putting in some of your favorite cards. With all of the historical reprints for 13,000 plus cards, a lot of these will be dirt cheap. It will just require some time and effort. I personally haven't really played the TCG properly in like 6 months plus at this point, and I'm still really enjoying myself because I'm creating my own fun outside of the current competitive ranked meta of TCG. The way that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is kind of being pigeonholed to be played by creating ways to play the way that I want to. If you don't like modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Then try thinking of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a sandbox. You don't need to force yourself to take part in playing it the way content creators or pros have you think it's played. You can make your own game out of it. With a vast and expansive card pool, you can absolutely find your own fun with the hundreds of different formats that the game has to offer. You can play with Pegasus rules, play with common cards only. There are many unique things to try. Chapter summary! I'm going to spend 10 minutes doing nothing, waiting for my opponent to combo off. They set up this ridiculous turn 1, and even if I draw a hand trap, they're just going to draw the perfect extender anyway. And that just ends the game in and of itself, or even if we do get to interact and go back and forth, the duel's over by turn 4 anyway. This is a typical standard argument many people will give for the gameplay aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! And why they don't enjoy it. Now, there is a ton of argumentation under the clause of gameplay, so I'm going to try my best to subcategorize as best as I can and tackle each point one at a time and look at the positives and negatives in sequence. There's just too much happening on the first turn of the game. Without a resource system, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is marred in combos, even from mid-range decks would take minutes to perform. If you don't draw a hand trap, you'll be sitting twiddling your thumbs, passing the time by maybe reading some of your opponent's cards to double check any hidden protections or quick effects from the grave that will be used on your turn, and after all is said and done, you try break the board, but the last card in hand... It sounds bad, but let's try and look at this objectively from the positives and the negatives. Now, the fact that Yugioh is unbound by any constraints like a resource system, it is in and of itself kind of a draw for a lot of players. I know it's crazy to think, but a huge portion of the player base like the fact that there isn't a resource system in Yugioh and that you can play the cards in your hand because they simply let you play the cards in your hand as long as they're legally activatable, which in most cases in Yugioh do work. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who don't, and that's why you don't play. But what are some of the things we can do to address this? Now, you can change up your deck list and play more go second cards. I know that sounds very obvious to the veterans among you watching this video, but so many times I've heard from newer players or less experienced players that they'll log into Master Duel, they watch their opponent play with themselves for 10 minutes just so they can set a card into a decimating loss, resulting in a colossal waste of time. But a lot of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is played simultaneously by both players, even on turn 1. With the inception of hand traps integrating themselves as a fundamental aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! Gameplay, you will definitely want to incorporate a lot of these in your deck lists. And further than just jamming 15 to 20 hand traps in all of your decks, do try and understand and learn where you can stop your opponent's plays. There is a plethora of YouTube content out there with gameplay and guides for various decks. You can learn a thing or two about the best decks and try capitalize on their weaknesses by saving your hand traps for clutch moments, or just jamming 3 on turn 1 and hoping they shut the fuck up. Another unique approach is embracing that turn 1 and capitalizing off of your opponent's overextension by playing cards that punish that type of gameplay. Consider cards like Lava Golem, Sphere Mode, Dark Ruler. You can even try decks like Tenpai. Budget versions of Tenpai is a deck perfect for this. Simply let your opponent play their whole hand and they can only put up so many disruptions that can beat a Raigeki chained by Droplet, or firing off a Lightning Storm before you begin activating a bunch of power spells that steal like Change of Heart and Snatch. Now obviously this isn't going to fix the unskippable cutscene waiting room that is turn 1 of Yu-Gi-Oh! But it is definitely an alternative approach that can alleviate some of the issues, either by fully embracing it with go second power cards, or by putting in as many hand traps as mathematically possible. Floodgates are cards that shut down an entire aspect of the game. Now, whether that's summoning monsters, searching cards, or flipping traps, there are plenty of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! That target specific mechanics and nullify them completely. Dimension Shifter does a lot against every graveyard deck in the game, and then some. Dimensional Barrier stops specific summoning strategies. Gee, I think I'm noticing a pattern with the word dimension. Cards like these have been around for a generation, from things like Vanity's Emptiness, to Mistake, to Anti-Spell, to Summon Limit. Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards have found ways to prevent as much Yu-Gi-Oh! From being played as possible. The solution to this, and I don't think these are very compelling arguments by the way, but nonetheless I will try and argue them and at least give you an alternative. You can try playing more cards that deal with floodgates, or playing other decks and strategies that are less targeted within that metagame. Now what I mean by this is, first and foremost, let's talk about card choices. You could try things like Lightning Storm in the main deck. Now even if you don't hit a floodgate, cards like Lightning Storm will find uses because of how generic it is. Called By is a great card that's good against every hand trap, especially if you're particularly frustrated with Shifter, because worst case scenario, it's going to have crossover with other disruptions in the format, like for example Promethean Princess. I know that a lot of these arguments do just sort of boil down to draw the out, and it is one of the most unfortunate aspects of the game, but ultimately floodgates exist to be able to give new players some chance and that carrot on a stick to be able to actually play the game against more experienced players and better decks. I don't like it, but they exist for a reason. So I'm sorry that this really does just sort of boil down to draw the out, but just draw the out. Now, as someone whose pet deck is over a decade old and soon to enter puberty, I understand more than anyone what it's like to have some of your favorite archetypes in the game be reduced to essentially jank. For a lot of you, some of your favorite memories are torn apart by every Yu-Gi-Oh! Card printed being just objectively better versions of your deck. Why would you bother playing something like Altergeist or Eldritch when Labyrinth is functionally the same type of deck and just significantly stronger? Why would you play Dragunity when Dragon Link is kind of better? Why would you play Adamancipator when Yubel is sort of functionally the same type of deck? Because I like them. I know, I get that more than anyone. But you would be surprised at just how many cards are constantly printed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Just try some other decks. Do some test hands on Dueling Book or Edo Pro for free before you invest the money into buying the cards, and I promise you'll be shocked at how much fun some modern decks are. I never would have seen myself liking Unchained, for example, until it came to Master Duel. I didn't think I would ever like a deck like Labyrinth until I just tried it. I know, it's very easy to be stubborn. It's very easy to scapegoat so much of your failures and so much of your inability to get success at the game by saying that your deck isn't good. but if you actually try play some of the meta decks, you will find that there is something for everyone, especially right now when there's like 10 viable decks. There's no way you won't enjoy at least one of them. Chapter summary. Yu-Gi-Oh! Prize support from the top level is a pretty underwhelming card to a rubber mat for getting top 64 at over 2,500 players. And even at the local level, getting loose packs is something that's very hard to get excited about. However, looking at your hobby through the lens of return on investment and a financial ladder is a doomed to fail endeavor from the onset. Playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Because you like the game is going to be far healthier for you. Now let's dive in a little bit. Without repeating too much of the arguments that's already been said and done for months at this point, Yu-Gi-Oh! Prize support for the best of the best players in this game is pretty abysmal. Especially when compared to the competitors that are Magic the Gathering and Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very behind. A rubber mat for 64th out of over 2,000 players after you spend a couple of hundreds on your deck, and now we assume that YCS topping players have an adequate collection and don't have to buy a whole deck outright from scratch, a couple of hundred for the flights and accommodation, food with the weekend, and suddenly the waifu bait printed on the mat looks not so appealing. Again, when competitors like One Piece or Lorcana are churning out thousands in prizing. If you're good at card games, unless you just absolutely love Yu-Gi-Oh!, a lot of players have decided to try out the other games instead. Now recently things have gotten better with exclusives like sleeves, dice, and the Steam Deck upgrades, but while moving the needle in the right direction and being a very positive welcome change, ultimately, it does not feel like it's quite enough. And I think the biggest thing that I realized is that we're not just talking about the top players here. Even at something like regionals, the prize support is a rubber mat and a deck box. Some of these regionals are hundreds of players. And for the local prize support being loose packs, again, this is something down to the local game stores, it just kind of doesn't really feel as exciting. And again, I just want to emphasize that while prize support is something that is very integral to a naturally and inherently competitive game, it is probably in your best interest to not play the game competitively purely for the sake of reward. Some of the best achievements in the world have come from people doing things out of love and sheer passion for those things. Looking at Yu-Gi-Oh! As a return on investment is, again, I think, strange behavior, but there is a middle ground where I think you could look at this maybe as, well, it's about your time and money and investments being respected. It's not expensive to print a bunch of more prize cards for Top Cut or something like that of a YCS, special rarity cards, ultimate rare exclusive Ash Blossoms, plenty of suggestions players have given for months, maybe even years at this point, for alternatives to prize support that could work well and actually be valuable with also basically no cost attached to them. For some of you, quitting Yu-Gi-Oh! Wasn't about the gameplay. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the poor prize support, questionable ban lists, or even Konami as a company. For many of us millennials who grew up with Yu-Gi-Oh! Cartoons on that Saturday morning with our siblings or friends, rushing to the stores after school to buy a singular booster pack, those days are just past us. Like ships in the night drifting past one another, maybe Yu-Gi-Oh! Just slipped by for the other things that mattered more. You have exams to study for, promotions at work to chase, clients to develop at your own business, or maybe kids of your own to take care of. As you get older, the world around you changes, the people around you change, and while the things you love evolved too, you also had to grow. Letting go is hard, but ultimately, the wheels of life spin and the winds of change blow. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I didn't give you too much of an existential crisis from the intro and outro of this video. But if you watched this far, consider dropping a like, a subscription for the channel, or following me on Twitch, and even considering becoming a patron for a singular dollar to be able to direct the conversation and flow of my content and have your name show up at the end of this slide. Now, adios!